Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over some tips for Australia. In my last video, I went over Canada, but I feel like I didn't do a great job covering it, to be honest. I gave some good tips, but I definitely left out a lot of stuff. In this video, I want to go over pretty much everything I know about the country in GeoGuessr. It's definitely going to be a bit of a longer video, and these tips should make you more accurate with your guesses. I'll start off by giving some tips on how to identify Australia, and then I'll give some tips for every individual state and territory. I'm going to go over the states and mainland territories, so any overseas or island territories I won't cover in this video, just because GeoGuessr sometimes classifies it as a different country, like Christmas Island for example. So let's just get right into that. Now before we get any further into the video, I just want to cover the Google coverage in Australia, because the way Australia is set up, it's kind of interesting. Since all cities are along the coastline and the outside, a lot of the coverage is just going to be in these cities, and there's pretty much nothing on the inside. I've just loaded up Google Earth here, and we can see a map of all official and unofficial coverage in Australia, and as you can see here, there's a lot around the outside, and as we get farther in, there's less and less coverage. And this can be valuable information if you're newer to the game, or just to make more accurate guesses, because when you're guessing in Australia, you should pretty much always just go for large cities like Sydney and Adelaide and Perth, because in Western Australia, as you can see right here, pretty much all the coverage is just around Perth. If we zoom in more, we can see that this is pretty sparse coverage, but then it gets very dense around here, and this is a very populated area, and it's pretty much the same thing. All of this is around Adelaide, and I mean Victoria and NSW are a bit different. Obviously there's more towns and cities farther into the states, but still a lot of it is pretty dense around cities, and it gets much sparser as you go out, and this is pretty much for all of Australia, except for Tasmania, but Tasmania is kind of its own thing. It's pretty distinct from the rest of Australia, obviously. As for identifying Australia, if you're new to the game, it can be common to confuse Australia with South Africa or New Zealand, but once you learn some of the ways to identify it, it's going to be very easy. The first thing you should know, and the easiest thing to know, is the bollards. Only Australia and Turkey have these bollards, and obviously Turkey is in the northern hemisphere. There's just like this single red strip in the middle. New Zealand bollards kind of look similar. I'll put a picture right here. As you can see, on New Zealand bollards, the red goes all the way around, whereas in Australia, the red is just in the middle right here. Another good way to identify Australia, and while this is a bit less common, it's still very good, as these highway markers with this black and white bar on the bottom is only found in Australia. And it's usually on the intersections of highways and roads, but you will only find this in Australia. South Africa has similar ones. Instead of white and black, it's red and black, and they're arrows instead of stripes. Another way to tell Australia apart from South Africa, if you struggle with that, is the road lines. Australia will have all white road lines, and South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini will all have yellow outer lines with white inner lines. And I'll put that right here so you can see. But yeah, Australia will have all white road lines. One final thing I wanted to cover, and this isn't exclusive to Australia, but it might help you narrow down some countries. But if you see these garbage cans with this colorful lid, sometimes it can be red, sometimes it can be yellow, sometimes it can be blue, but with this green garbage can and then a yellow or colorful lid, is pretty much only found in Australia and New Zealand, I believe. So now that we're able to identify Australia, before we go into breaking down various regions, I think it's important to go over, if you don't know, the states of Australia. Now Australia has 6 states, and these are Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania down here. And on the mainland there are 2 territories. There is obviously the Northern Territory up here, and there's the Australian Capital Territory, which pretty much just has Canberra, the capital city, in it. And this is just a small territory within New South Wales, as you can see right here. Obviously these states are quite large, but if we look at a population density map of Australia, these states basically become smaller because most of this is completely empty land, and it's just around the coast in cities that you'll have high populations. And this is where most of the coverage, like I said earlier, this is where most of the coverage actually is just in these cities and these surrounding cities area. Now that we're done with all that, let's move on to actually breaking down the various states and territories of Australia. And right away we're going to start off with Western Australia and basically just Perth. But every city and town in Western Australia will feature these yellow sign poles, and they're on pretty much all the signs around here. This is probably the best way to tell that you are in Western Australia and Perth. But if you don't have a sign around you, then the best way is going to be the license plates. And compared to the rest of the license plates in Australia, the ones in Western Australia are pretty unique. With the blur, they kind of resemble a European plate with the blue stripes, but they have blue on them where most of Australia doesn't have blue on them. Only Victoria does, and it's definitely a noticeable difference between Western Australia and Victoria. Now we are in South Australia. I only really have one tip lined up for South Australia, and it's pretty much all you need. It's these poles. Luckily Australia has a lot of unique poles that are distinct for each state, are unique to only South Australia. So you won't find them anywhere else in the world. They have this darker outside obviously with a lighter inside. They're very unique. You won't find them anywhere else in the world. Moving on to Tasmania, this is the only Australian state that isn't connected to the mainland. It's an island right below Victoria. Generally, the landscape is one of the best ways to tell that you're in Tasmania. Compared to the rest of Australia, which is quite flat, Tasmania has a lot of mountains and a lot of forests and is quite green compared to Australia, which tends to be pretty dry. Of course, landscape isn't the only thing you should be looking for. Like a lot of other states in Australia, the poles in Tasmania are quite unique, as if you look closely here, you'll have this band on the poles, and if we just move around, you can see that they're on every single pole. These are only in Tasmania, Australia. And this is actually something I just learned quite recently. But yeah, they're on every single pole. You kind of have to look closely for some of them, as they do blend in pretty well with the pole. Moving north to Victoria, Victoria also has more unique poles. While these won't be everywhere, if you find concrete poles and you're pretty sure you're in Australia, you're almost always going to be in Victoria. Victoria has a lot of concrete poles, like this one, but you shouldn't only be going off of poles because sometimes they can be hard to find. License plates are also a good way to tell where you are, especially in Victoria. Similar to Western Australia, which also had blue on the plates, Victoria does as well, but if you look closely, it's a small strip of blue, kind of at the top in the middle. It can kind of be hard to see if the lighting isn't great, and unfortunately this isn't a great example, but if the lighting is good, the sun's shining on it, it can be pretty clear to see. And one more thing about Victoria, but also kind of just Australia in general, is you're going to have a very wide array of coverages. So pretty much anywhere there isn't a city, you're going to have Gen 2 coverage. Especially in Victoria, it's quite common to get Gen 1 coverage. And you'll only really find Gen 1 coverage in some very rural places in Australia, especially Victoria, and like northern Canada and some places in South Africa. It's not very common, so this definitely narrows it down a lot. Moving on to New South Wales, or NSW. NSW is pretty flat, but it has a lot of trees, and especially these kinds of trees. It's very flat, quite green though, unlike Western Australia and some parts of South Australia, which are also flat, but will have a lot of desert and typically more dry in appearance. Of course, once again, landscape isn't the thing you should be going off of 100% of the time, and NSW license plates are quite unique. They are these yellow ones, and they're like a bright yellow color as well. One right here, very good view. This one's also covered up, you can see it kind of back there. But yeah, if you find these bright yellow license plates, there's a good chance you're going to be in NSW and kind of around the Sydney area, which is where most of the coverage is. Moving on to our final state in Australia, and once again we have a unique pole. I actually covered this in my one tip every country in GeoGuessr shorts series, but if you didn't see that, I said that Queensland, Australia will have these numbers on the poles. These are only found in Queensland. Sometimes it can be a bit hard to see. Now moving on to our first territory, we have the Australian Capital Territory, which is basically just Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. And this isn't a very common place to get, but the license plates again will tell you where you are. The Canberra license plates have blue text on them, so you'll have a bit of a blue tint. Again, it can kind of be hard to tell the difference between the Canberra license plates and the Western Australian license plates, but typically you're going to have Gen 2 coverage in Canberra. And we have our final territory, which is the Northern Territory. Like a lot of other regions in Australia, there are distinct poles for Northern Territory, and these ones are very unique. They kind of look rusted. They're these ladder poles that are metal and they're brown. As you can see, they go all down here. And then if we move over here, we actually have different ones. But these ones, as you can see, are also metal and not wood. And it's just like this brown metal pole. The roads and the dirt in Northern Territory are also pretty unique to the region. And if we look closely here, we can see that the road is kind of tinted a red or a brown color. The dirt itself is definitely a lighter brown or a red color. And I'm just in the largest city, Darwin, right here, which if you're in an urban area in Northern Territory, this is pretty much the only place you should be guessing. And the plates in Northern Territory have red text on them, so there'll be a bit of a red tint. Just like in Alberta, Canada, or Belgium. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Obviously if I got anything wrong, please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed or learned something from the video, please leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.